So welcome everyone. I'm glad you're all here to join us in this event. Lynn and I would like to thank the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, as well as the Malcolm S. Forbes Center for Culture and Media for their generous support for this symposium. We would also like to thank our various other co-sponsors, the Departments of Africana Studies, American Studies, English, Modern Culture and Media, and Theater and Performance Studies, as well as the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women, the Kogut Center for the Humanities, and the Office of the Dean of the College. So that is a lot of people coming together to make this happen. We're all very grateful. And last but not least, this event could not have been made possible without the support, time, and energy of CSREA Director Tricia Rose, and the wonderful staff at CSREA, Caitlin Murphy and Christina Downs, and our invaluable MCM administrators, Susan McNeil and Liza Heber. So thank you so much. Please join us in welcoming all of our panelists in our first panel today, Diverse History, Histories of Diversity. Thank you.
So I just wanted to introduce all the panelists in order of speaking. I know that it's on the program, but it's a ritual at every convention to have somebody stand up and get out of the way quickly. This is actually a panel I've been looking forward to at the end of a very long semester. I cannot wait to not be speaking and to just be listening to three such brilliant, fabulous people at 10 o'clock in the morning. So I want to thank them for being here and being up early. So very quickly, to start, we have Brown alum Matthew Delmont, who will be sharing a paper on the other history of television and civil rights. Matt's book, The Nicest Kids in Town, was published by the University of California in 2012, so we should have a round of applause for Brown alum who makes it back. The second speaker today, the famous Anne Lucille, who I had the fortune of meeting just a few weeks ago, author most famously of The Coupling Convention, Sex, Text, and Tradition in Black Women's Fiction and Skin Trade, published in 1996, visiting professor of gender studies at Brown University, and emerita professor of English at Wesleyan University, where she was the William R. Kennan Professor of Humanities and the director of the Center for African American Studies. Her paper today, taken from a book that she's been working on, is Game Show Theory and the Prism of Race. So please, Anne Lucille. And then lastly, all the way from Los Angeles, overnight, but fully rested, and he'll need it because he is both professor and chair of sociology at UCLA and the director of UCLA's Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies, which is tough.
Yeah.
Chair and director. Is Darnell Hunt. His own research, you surely know. He's the author of Screening the Los Angeles Riots, Race, Seeing, and Resistance, and O.J. Simpson Facts and Fictions, New Rituals in Construction of Reality. I really do need a moment to sit and enjoy these papers. His talk today is titled Race and the Hollywood Project, Flipping the Script. So please welcome him and welcome them all.
Thank you, Matt, for that warm introduction. Thank you for everyone coming out at 10 o'clock on a Friday morning. Thank you to all the organizers of the panel, and thank you to Lynn George for inviting me out. Lynn was on my dissertation committee, and so my career trajectory would have looked totally different if it would not have happened into Lynn's reality television class, my second year of grad school. It totally changed the trajectory of my intellectual interests, taught me how to study television, so thank you, Lynn. Thank you. My presentation today is called The Other History of Television and Civil Rights. Draws on a new book project coming out this March. It's called Why Busing Failed. You can find out more about the book at whybusingfailed.com and sort of walk through a lot of the arguments of the book. The part of the book I'm talking about today is about how we talk about the history of television civil rights. In the shortest way to say it, we're telling the wrong story about the relationship between television and civil rights. Right? So I want to start by talking about what the traditional story we tell is, then talk about why we need to be talking about it differently, and then conclude by talking about why this matters today. So the story we tell about television civil rights is that television played a really progressive role in terms of pushing the Southern civil rights movement into the national consciousness. Right? I'm not saying that story is not true. Right? That is an important thing that television was able to do. It's attested to by television professionals and also civil rights activists. So quotes from CBS producer William Peters. So the Negro Revolution of the 1960s could not have occurred without TV coverage that brought it to home, every home in the land, made the facts of Mississippi come alive in Minnesota. Right? So television was able to bring the South, the horrors of Little Rock, Selma, Montgomery, into the nation's living rooms and make people pay attention to it. Okay? It was also important to be able to capture these incidents of violence. Right? So from Wallace Westfield, even without any commentary, a shot of a big white man spitting and cursing at black children did more to open up the national intellect than newspapers ever could. Right? So the visual power of television, to be able to be on the scene, to be live, and broadcast these images of violence brought nationally, did help propel civil rights. So we have TV professionals attesting to it, and we also have civil rights activists saying television played an important role. Someone like Julian Bond, who coordinated the media efforts for SNCC. Had it not been for TV, I do not think the civil rights movement could have succeeded as quickly. I think we would have won in the end, but television brought it out just so much more quickly. Then Martin Luther King, one of the most famous quotes, I think the one that really helps capture the essence of what was going on. This is in the context of the march from Selma to Montgomery. It said, "We're here to say to the white men that we will no longer let them use clubs on us in dark corners. We're going to make them do it in the glaring light of television." Right? So for civil rights activists, television offered some manner of protection, but also the hope that bringing these incidents of violence to a national audience would change the direction of the country. And to a large extent it did. Right? So that story is partially true, but it's limited. It's a limited and limiting story that we tell about the history of television and civil rights. Why it's limited and limiting is that it focuses on the South in a discrete period of time. Right? So if we think about the rest of the history of civil rights, it's not just the South. Right? The civil rights protests were going on, the Black Freedom Movement was going on across the country, right? In Los Angeles, in Cleveland, in Chicago, in Detroit, in New York, in Boston. If we focus just on this period in the South, we ignore all of that, right? The story actually looks very different when we take a national perspective on it and when we don't end in 1965, right? So if we increase our chronological scape, increase our national scape, the story looks very different. And I want to actually argue that television played an anti-civil rights role if we take it into larger perspective. The place to start to understand this, not only focusing on busing, it's not the only civil rights issue, but it was one of the dominant national issues of the late 20th century. This is a screenshot, I'll show you the clip behind it, for a protest of white parents who were against school integration in New York. The 15,000 white mothers was in quotes because this is the language that got picked up in the media. This march happened while senators were debating the Civil Rights Act. Right? And this was something that was mentioned repeatedly on the floor of Congress in the debates that were going on in the Civil Rights Act. Southern senators would mention these protests as a way to point out the hypocrisy of their northern colleagues, that the Civil Rights Act was going to be focused on the South and not focused on the North. What they were protesting was a plan to pair a handful of schools in New York to promote racial integration, try to segregate the schools. So this was an anti-school integration march. Right? They marched from the school board building in Brooklyn, across the Brooklyn Bridge, into downtown Manhattan. I'll show 3 short clips to give you a sense of how this was covered by television news. So these activists purposely modeled their displays after black civil rights activists, right, to gain the same kind of television coverage. And one of the problems that I'm identifying is that television didn't distinguish between the two movements, right? They covered this in the same way, the same shot selection, the same kind of interview techniques as they covered the movement in the South. So first, there's no audio, but just a picture of them walking over the bridge. This is covered on all the major networks. And again, just producing scale, right? The point of getting 10,000 parents out on a rainy, snowy day in the winter in New York is to produce scale and let people know that we're not happy about this plan. It was primarily mothers who were marching. I can talk more about that in the Q&A. But the language they're using, this is when we start to see the language of neighborhood schools, protecting neighborhood schools. So it's not explicitly about being opposed to racial integration, but that's the upshot of what they're pushing for. And then the last clip is a woman making that very explicitly clear.
as much as our opponents who use the same tactics. We feel that we have as much right as they do. Justice, people on civil rights and we're taking advantage of them.
So these are our civil rights and we're taking advantage of them. I'm not the first scholar to point out the fact that people who are against civil rights co-opted the language of civil rights to push back against it. But I think scholars haven't paid enough attention to the way in which these were broadcast nationally, right? They were using the language, but television never questioned this use of language, right? They were interested in the scene, interested in the protests, interested in bringing these protests in this language to a national audience, never taking a step back to think about what kind of civil rights claims are these parents advancing. When they say we're using the same tactics as our opponents, they're talking about the massive civil rights protests against educational inequality that were taking place across the North. So on the left, there was a school boycott in February 1964 in New York to get students to stay out of school for one day and attend what they called freedom schools, right, at churches or rec centers to protest the intransigence of the New York School Board. This is the largest civil rights protest of the era, right? It's larger than the March on Washington, and almost no one knows about it. Okay. This is part of the invisibility of the movement in the North, is that this isn't something we usually talk about, right? This wasn't just New York. On the right-hand side is Chicago. 200,000 students stayed out of school. It was true in Gary, it was true in Seattle, it was true in Boston, right? This was one of the techniques that people were using, civil rights activists were using, to point out that our schools are very much like what's going on in the South. Like, school segregation is an issue in the North. We need people to pay attention to it. One of the reasons we don't talk about it now is the media, both print and television, didn't treat this with the same moral urgency as it treated civil rights in the South, right? The quickest way to see this is look at the New York Times editorial on that boycott we just saw, right? Civil rights leaders seem hell-bent on staging a Negro and Puerto Rican student boycott in New York City schools, are set on a reckless course. At the end, it's a violent, illegal approach of adult and encouraged truancy, right? The New York Times, Chicago Tribune, the major newspapers of the North were opposed to civil rights in their own city, right? They were bold in terms of covering civil rights that was happening thousands of miles away, right? In the South, they were much more timid in covering things that were going on in their own backyard. This model, it gets established in the early 1960s, continues in the 1970s. The best way to see this is through an anti-busing activist named Irene McCabe. Historian Nathan Irvin Huggins pointed this out as early as 1978. He said, television cameras broadcast the sentiments of the white Pontiac, Michigan housewife, Irene McCabe, protesting forced busing as earnestly as they had the achievement of Mrs. Rosa Parks in the Montgomery bus boycott. Right? So she received tremendous national attention. I want to show just two clips to give you a sense of how widely her protest circulated. So she was protesting a school integration order in Pontiac, right? A very small scale thing. They got broadcast nationally on all the major networks.
The outcomes. With another wave of school openings coming tomorrow, many communities are struggling with the complex and highly emotional problem of busing. Bob Barr was in Pontiac, Michigan, where the issue brought protesters into the streets today.
This is the third time in a week that Pontiac has seen a public protest against court-ordered busing. Last Monday, explosives destroyed 10 empty school buses. 2 nights later, an anti-busing rally attracted several thousand persons to the local stadium. Today, on the day before school opens, about 6,000 persons marched. Under the court's plan, close to 9,000 of Pontiac's 24,000 students would be bused to achieve better racial balance. Critics of the plan here say it's unnecessary, too expensive, and will eventually drive whites out of Pontiac.
How many are going to keep their children home? Nowhere but home. Don't weaken, don't get discouraged, don't let their threats frighten you because they wouldn't hold up in court. And so what if they do? We'll go together. If we don't stand up now to this threat, we have no country left for our children. It's not immigration, it's communism.
And when you do something to
That's from September 1971. She gets national coverage in newspapers, television for over a year, lobbying against busing in Pontiac, right? And you can think about why would the rest of the country care about busing in Pontiac? Television cared about it because it was a great story, right? I can talk more about how she's telegenic. She's a tremendous grassroots leader, right? But this is what civil rights television looks like by the 1970s. It's anti-civil rights television, right? They're structuring, and she's explicit about this. She says the black militants, Martin Luther King, they marched for things and they got what they wanted. We need to do the same thing, right? Their marches look very, very similar to things that happened years earlier in the South, right? American flags, mothers and children foregrounded, voice it in the language, these are our rights, right? Television is on the scene to cover this. Her largest effort was leading a mother's march from Pontiac, Michigan to Washington, D.C. And of course, marching on Washington was a purposeful echo of what was going on in the civil rights movement. They marched 620 miles, right? Part of what she was doing was creating the media spectacle, right? So she got coverage when they left Pontiac. She got coverage all along the route. There were pictures of her and the other mothers icing their feet, talking about how much they were suffering walking this far. And then when they finally arrived in Washington, D.C., it received national attention again. So I played this clip from April 1972.
A group of mothers from Michigan today completed a 44-day walk to Washington to protest school busing. They were followed by a smaller group who had hiked more than 100 miles from Richmond, Virginia. And they were joined by sympathizers from several other states. Tony Sargent reports. The marching mothers reached Capitol Hill after 620 miles of walking from Pontiac, Michigan, spending each night in motels along the way. They came to urge House action on an anti-busing constitutional amendment. 65 more congressmen's signatures would force it to a House vote. Their leader is Irene McCabe, housewife and mother, who's refused since last fall to let her own daughter be bused to another school. Mrs. McCabe and the others all had foot and leg problems along the way, some requiring doctor's care, but discomfort was forgotten amid the cheers. Among legislators greeting Mrs. McCabe was House Republican leader Gerald Ford, who said he thought she'd be successful. Also on hand, Republican William Brock of Tennessee, sponsoring the anti-busing amendment in the Senate, and Congresswoman Louise Day Hicks, the anti-busing champion from Massachusetts. The marchers then moved from the Capitol to a rally near the Washington Monument. Despite perfect weather, only about 1,500 persons showed up, but Mrs. McCabe was undaunted.
I can't believe we walked the whole way.
Mrs. McCabe told the crowd she was speaking as a mother.
Whenever you're in labor, you finally give birth to something beautiful. We've labored long, and we've been through a great deal of pain, but it's worth it, because we have given birth now to the rekindling of the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Look, you're here.
Despite Mrs. McCabe's dramatic march, today's turnout was far smaller than expected. So another rally has been scheduled for Saturday afternoon near the White House. Tony Sargent, CBS News, Washington. And that's the way it is. Thursday, April 27th, 1972.
1,500 people turned out for the march, right? That's a tremendous amount of media attention for what ended up being a very small rally, right? So part of what I'm interested in is how television was interested in the spectacle she was creating, right? She couldn't actually move people to drive to Washington, D.C. and join her protest necessarily, but she's able to move the needle in terms of whether Americans stop busing was worthwhile or not, right? She received national coverage on all the major networks and newspapers across the country and ended up only producing 1,500 people. One of the things that is interesting about the Pontiac case and a number of the other cases that received national attention is television was much more interested and was much more able to cover the protests against busing than they were able to understand the legal complexities of the issue, right? Or even, in some cases, the very basic understanding of why school districts were being asked to integrate. In Pontiac, the judge who made the busing order was Judge Damon Keith. He said, "This court finds that the Pontiac Board of Education intentionally utilized the power at their disposal to locate new schools and arrange boundaries in such a way as to perpetuate the pattern of segregation within the city and thereby deliberately prevented integration. Where a Board of Education has contributed and played a major role in the development and growth of segregated situations, the board is guilty of de jure segregation." Okay. Now, de jure segregation is segregation by law. It's usually the term we associate with the South, and usually we associate with the North de facto. De facto is nonsense, right? But it was very hard for civil rights activists to make that clear. Right? When we talk about de facto, we think it's innocent, right? That somehow these schools in the North just happen to become segregated, right? The neighborhoods just happen to become segregated. That's factually inaccurate. We have books and books and books that show us now that federal policies created segregated neighborhoods, school boards rezoned their lines, they redo the lines to create segregated school districts, right? And the courts that found these, right, in Boston, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in Detroit, right, in Pontiac, these schools were intentionally segregated, right? So this wasn't optional, right? Irene McCabe was advocating going against the rule of the court, right, the rule of the law, but that didn't get presented in the same way as people who were going against the law in the South, right? It was somehow less morally urgent to integrate Pontiac schools than it was Little Rock schools. Right? The thing about why was Irene McCabe so appealing to news agencies, one thing was that she was telegenic, she was compellingly spoken, I would say. She had that kind of sort of folk-spun wisdom that made her appealing to the news agencies. I think even more than that, television was sick of covering black people by the late 1960s, early 1970s, and they said as much. I can show you several quotes here. The one I'll show is from an NBC person. It says, "In TV news departments, we appear to know a lot about the black minority. It's the silent majority we must explore. We haven't done it. We didn't know it was there." Right? Yeah. So Irene McCabe is interesting to them because it's the same storyline, right? They can peg it to a story. It's about civil rights. It's about school integration, but it's a different face to put to it, right? We're not talking about black people anymore. Now we talk about the white opposition to it, right? And I wouldn't call it backlash because white people were never not opposed to school integration, right? So they weren't waiting for these court orders to start opposing it. They were always opposed to it. So I think the backlash language is misleading. The second reason they were interested is that television news, it has the national perspective, but it has to assign its television camera crews to go to specific places to capture that news when it's happening, right? So it can't, I like this quote from an NBC producer. It says, "We have the whole country to cover. We can't just set up cameras and wait for news to happen somewhere. We have to plan it out in advance." Right? That's not usually what we think about in terms of news, but it helps explain why Irene McCabe received so much attention, right? Once she got 5,000 people together in Pontiac, right, people were like, wait, Pontiac's a site of struggle in this, right? Let's get she was on the radar for national news, right? That's why she received more and more attention. I'll close by talking about that's why Boston received so much attention. Once something becomes a story, whether anything happens there or not, the television news personnel are already on the scene to cover it again, right? So that's the best explanation I can give for why people like Irene McCabe were so appealing. So let me conclude the busing portion by talking about Boston, which is the most famous case of busing. This clip is from September 1964. This is the start of the Boston busing crisis, and I use crisis in quotes.
The Boston school system is scheduled to begin busing Thursday in compliance with the federal judge's integration order. Opponents of the busing plan shouted their bitterness at a rally today and refused to listen to the man regarded as the state's most popular politician. Jackie Castleberry reports.
8,000 to 10,000 parents and children came to Boston Common to protest the court-ordered busing. They carried signs, sang songs, and heard angry anti-busing speeches. One of their targets, pro-busing Senator Edward Kennedy, tried to speak, but parents blocked his path to microphones and refused to hear him.
Can I speak? Are you going to listen part of our speech? The people don't care to hear you.
As Senator Kennedy retreated toward his office, the crowd began to push, hurling eggs and insults. Just as the senator reached shelter inside, the crowd rushed, pounding and then shattering the glass window. After more speeches, the crowd ended the day's protest singing, "God Bless America." Jackie Castleberry, CBS News, Boston.
So Boston is the city we associate most closely with busing, right? But by this point, busing had already been a national issue for almost 2 decades, right? And even in Boston, school segregation had been an issue for at least 15 years. This moment, though, in 1974, marked the start of what would become to be called the Boston busing crisis, right? And so once television was already on the scene here, they never left for 2 years, right? And there was violence in Boston. I don't want to downplay the violence, but it received so much attention that it skewed our understanding, our memory of what busing was actually about. The simplest way I can put it is, once Boston received this kind of attention, the story became about the feelings and emotions of white parents rather than about the rights of black children, right? That's what was going on previously with the busing coverage. That's what showed up most evidently in Boston. What it missed out on were the long tradition of civil rights activism in Boston. So women like Ruth Batson and Ellen Jackson, who were also mother activists, right? I can talk more in the Q&A about what it means that Irene McCabe and other white mothers are able to claim this mantle of, we're doing this for our children, when black mothers can't in the same way, right? At least they can't in national media in the same way. these, Ruth Batson especially, were tremendous activists, right? They left a tremendous record of activism in Boston that's not recognized in the larger conversation we usually have about school segregation in Boston. The other thing that, again, was missed out on was the fact that Boston schools were intentionally segregated, right? This wasn't optional. This wasn't some judge's whim. These schools were intentionally segregated. Judge Garrity, when he made the ruling, said the court concludes that the defendants took many actions in their official capacities with the purpose and intent to segregate the Boston public schools, and that such actions caused current conditions of segregation in the Boston public schools. Plaintiffs have proved that defendants intentionally segregated schools at all levels, right? That's not usually what we talk about when we talk about busing. Right? We talk about, oh, it wasn't hard for white parents to send their kids here or black parents to send their kids here. It was about intentionally segregated schools that didn't look that much different than what was going on in the South. The clip I showed prompted the most famous book we have on the history of busing, which is J. Anthony Lucas's Common Ground. And he said, recalling watching that clip, says, what in the world's going on when Teddy Kennedy is driven to shelter by his own people? What in the world is a pretty good starting place for a story? Now, Lucas is a pretty good storyteller, but this book is nonsense, right? As a way to try to understand the history of civil rights in Boston, right? In part because starting with this clip is misleading, right? It's a good story if you want to talk about what it means for white Irish folks to be against Teddy Kennedy, right? But that's not the history of civil rights in Boston, right? It's about the emotions, frustrations, and anger of white people, which is not the story of school segregation and desegregation in Boston. So why this matters today? I imagine many of you heard the This American Life piece by Nicole Hannah-Jones, which has kind of reopened a space to talk about the possibility of school integration, school desegregation in the country. So the reason I titled my book, Why Busing Failed, is that I think there's a lasting perception that busing failed, right? And what I try to do in the book is try to understand why it failed. The clearest explanation I can offer is that busing failed because media, courts, politicians treated the opinions and perspectives of white parents more seriously than the rights of black children. Okay. That's the history of why busing failed. We have a perspective that busing failed as a policy issue, that somehow we tried busing, we ran some tests, saw if it worked, and waited. It wasn't like that at all. It was an emotionally based issue. Politicians didn't want to offend their white constituents, right? Media didn't get to the bottom of why these busing orders were being put in place. They focused on the anti-busing perspectives, and as a result, our textbooks are written around Boston. It bookends, it's the end of the civil rights movement, right? That's a mythical history that does us no good, right? So I hope that my book can in some way provide a backstory to understand why this work is so important to reopen this public dialogue about the possibility of school desegregation. Right? And the last thing I think is, it's been fascinating to think about all the stuff that's been going on, including at Brown, in the last couple of years, right? And I'm compelled by the Time magazine cover and the connections people are making between 1960s, 1970s, the civil rights struggles in that era, and the lasting impacts of what's going on in the present. What I hope that my research can help shade is that a couple things. We don't really fully understand, in our popular understanding of civil rights, what was going on in the 60s and 70s, right? We have a kind of mythic history where we focus too easily on a simplistic story of Rosa Parks or a simplistic story of Martin Luther King, and then the movement goes to the north and things splinter and fall apart, and there's white backlash, and it's too bad it didn't work, but it didn't work. If we actually investigate what was going on, we can see that the majority of white people didn't support civil rights if it impacted their own schools and neighborhoods in any way, right? That's not comfortable to talk about, but it's true, right? And it helps us think about why so many of the things we're dealing with today are still here, right? And when I think about the legacy of how we talk about civil rights in the United States, it's like we want to claim the trophy for a race we didn't finish, right? And I think if we focus on the history of civil rights in the North, think seriously about issues of busing, think seriously about how television didn't do the progressive role that we like to think it did, we can talk more honestly about the history of civil rights and about what's going on in our present moment. Thank you.
Handout that I'm going to be passing out.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I am delighted to be here, and I want to thank Tricia, Lynn, and Brandy for the invitation and their wonderful staffs for all of the support. I'm particularly delighted to be on a panel with true scholars whose work I admire, and it's very interesting to me to hear Matthew talk about Boston in particular and busing, because I'm from the area, it's my history. I worked on a federally funded desegregation project that used the arts to facilitate the integration of the desegregation of the Boston public schools. And my father is mentioned in that nonsense book of Common Ground. So anyway, I'm very close to my time limit, so I'm just going to dive in. My mother was a great fan of TV game shows. She was also remarkably good at many of them. Some of my earliest childhood memories are of watching her outplay contestant after contestant on picture and word puzzle game shows like Concentration in the 1950s, and later Wheel of Fortune, which was her all-time favorite. She was so phenomenally good at Wheel that in the latter decades of her relatively long life, family, friends, and neighbors would gather around to watch her solve puzzles from the comfort of her recliner faster than Vanna White could turn the letters on the puzzle board. Ironically, though, it was this very puzzle-solving prowess that ultimately caused my mother to quit Wheel of Fortune cold turkey in the late 1990s. She was so good at the game that it just became too frustrating when contestants failed to solve what for her were easy puzzles, especially and most particularly when those contestants were Black. She had endured decades of white folks' fumbles, shaking her head in disapproval, but watching and playing on. But as more Black contestants appeared on the show, rooting for the home team took on new meaning and became a kind of racial imperative. When a brother or sister flubbed the obvious, misreading a fully completed puzzle as world's largest dessert instead of desert, or I have not yet begun to fight instead of begun, it placed a kind of shame on all our shoulders. My mother was well aware of the educational inequities behind such misreadings. Her hard-hearted response to the verbal faults and epic fails of Black contestants was the byproduct of an even deeper understanding of the metonymic nature of American racism, by which any Black is every Black, not an individual, but a stereotype. Charity was overridden by the reigning ideology of racial uplift and respectability politics, whereby it was the sacred duty of every man, woman, and child to put his or her best foot forward at all times. Inconsequential as a game show appearance might seem, the white world was watching one and judging all. It was essential, therefore, that the colored contestant show well for the sake of the race. Part of the American dream at mid-century, racial uplift is most often associated with the bourgeois aspirations of an educated Black elite who believed that the best and brightest among them must reach back and pull up the colored masses in the cause of advancing the race. Perhaps the best known articulation of uplift ideology is the notion of the talented 10th, popularized by W.E.B. Du Bois in an essay of the same name, in which he argues for the higher classical education of a few good men who will save the Negro race. My parents were neither middle class nor college educated, yet their hopes, ideals, values, and beliefs were similar to those of the Black bourgeoisie, and they were by no means unique among the masses. In all corners of mid-century America, millions of poor black parents like mine moved heaven and earth to give their children keys to the kingdoms of culture, class, and capitalism. Not only the equal education fought for in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, but also the music lessons, dance classes, silver tongues, and polished manners they believed were part of preparing us to lead ethical, examined lives of service and achievement, rather than the quiet desperation Thoreau attributes to the masses. As it began to enter American households in the 1950s, television, oddly enough, quickly became part of the master plan for the advancement of colored people, a new, thoroughly modern instrument of uplift that would show off African Americans at their most accomplished. And black people were not alone in envisioning television's potential for progressive racial profiling. White TV pioneers like Ed Sullivan and Steve Allen, both of whom regularly showcased black talent on their programs, viewed the emergent medium as a kind of great equalizer that subtly contributed to the cause of civil rights by bringing the talents of the Negro into the living rooms of mainstream America, where, as Sullivan said, public opinion is formed and hearts and minds are changed. Both Sullivan and Allen were vocal about their commitment to integration via video, even contributing articles on the subject of race and TV to Ebony magazine, then the leading black publication along with Jet. Television needs the Negro performer and benefits by his contributions to the medium, Allen wrote in 1955. Sullivan had been even more explicit in an earlier Ebony article, writing in May of 1950, recognizing the place of the Negro in television is not generosity. It is just common sense and good business. That good business, common sense, literally could be calculated in dollars and cents, as Sullivan's words reveal. In what he describes as the early, lean days when the squalling infant industry of television needed help, generous, that's his word, Negro stars, including high-profile headliners who had worked with him in vaudeville and were willing to talk friendship, not money, lent their big talent to the small screen. In other words, something other than integration was at stake. Nothing less than the fate of television itself rested, at least in part, on the talents and popular appeal of generous Negro stars. This twist on the talented 10th, the fact that early television literally depended on cheap black talent, helps explain the contradictory racial dynamics of the fledgling industry. On one hand, it disappeared black difference from dramas and domestic series like Lassie and I Love Lucy. On the other, it counted on colored people for comedy, diversity, adversity, and what I call debased relief in a host of other TV programs, ranging from black shows like Beulah and Amos and Andy to westerns like The Lone Ranger and the Cisco Kid, variety shows like Jack Benny with Rochester, and talent competitions like Ted Mack's Original Amateur Hour, where a 7-year-old Gladys Knight was a winner, as well as game shows like Queen for a Day, Name That Tune, and Strike It Rich. A forerunner and possible progenitor of the oxymoronic category of reality TV, game shows may seem to have little to do with the advancement of non-whites. I turn to these shows both because they constitute my earliest experiences of television, and because I have a theory that as game shows go, so goes the medium, and perchance the nation. That is to say, I'm interested not in the games themselves, but in what they may say about their moments, what they may tell us about the blackening of American culture. My mother passed away in 2002 at the age of 80. She lived to see her preferred type of programming come of age with its own network, GSN, the Game Show Network. But she missed the major turn in the genre that I suggest is symbolic of larger trends in television and popular culture. Once light, bright, and mostly white, game shows have gone over to the dark side. Not only are most of them liberally peppered with contestants of color, but several of them, including long-running network standards like Let's Make a Deal, Family Feud, and The Newlywed Game, are now also hosted by Black celebrities, most of them comedians. Moreover, since these shows went black, their ratings have soared. Since Steve Harvey took over Family Feud in 2010, for example, its ratings have skyrocketed, landing it second only to the biggest daytime audience grabber and moneymaker of all. Do you know what it is?
The Price is Right.
No, it's way, Price is Right is way back there. I mean, even Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune have been passed by Family Feud under Steve Harvey's direction. Think daytime. Okay.
These ones.
Judge Judy. Okay. Judge Judy, which I actually think is one of the most dangerous shows on TV, and we can perhaps talk about that during the Q&A. Okay. The Black Gold Rush doesn't start or stop with game shows. It has invaded almost every genre, from small claims melodramas and tabloid reality shows like Judge Judy, Maury, and Jerry Springer, all of which rake in millions exhibiting people of color and the white lumpen proletariat at their worst and most outrageous. To talk shows, soap operas, reality shows, sitcoms like Blackish and Tyler Perry's House of Pain, and even hit primetime dramas such as Empire and Scandal. Some media analysts consider this technicolor turn in TV to be part of the Obama effect. The election of an African-American president in 2008, the argument goes, alerted television executives to the possibility of cashing in on a shifting demographic and changing national character that is perhaps more open to diversity than ever before. By my reckoning, however, the trend predates the 2008 election and may have more to do with the Oprah effect, the tremendous influence Oprah Winfrey wields with her extensive fan base, which some say helped put Obama in office. Oprah's megawatt, multi-million-dollar success changed the character and the color of daytime TV, paving the way for other Black entertainers such as Steve Harvey, the comedian, actor, author, radio, and game show host, who The Hollywood Reporter predicts will be the next Oprah Winfrey. In addition to Family Feud, which airs multiple times a day and a night on several networks, Harvey also hosts his own Emmy Award-winning talk show, where he dishes dirt and doles out dating advice to the female lovelorn. Harvey, one of the original kings of comedy, has been picked to click as the Technicolor king of daytime, methinks, largely because he performs a valorized brand of vernacular Blackness. And for however long it may last, this is a time when television does well to cater to what it takes to be the tastes of Black people and the audiences who emulate them. From their viewing habits and spending patterns to their conspicuous consumption of everything from hair products to smartphones, 21st century African Americans are such obvious candidates for target marketing that some media analysts wonder why the industry hasn't paid more attention to the getting and spending, moving and shaking of Black consumers and cultural producers. According to market research, the black population is younger and more media savvy than the populace at large and exerts tremendous influence on pop culture. African Americans watch significantly more TV than any other racial group, as much as 37% more, and have an escalating collective buying power topping the $1 trillion mark. Daytime TV is getting the message and is eager to pick up and promote whatever black goose it thinks will lay the Oprah kind of golden egg, even if that goose is actually a gander named Harvey. You know, like the rabbit. But there may be something else driving the turn to black game show hosts. Cedric the Entertainer, who briefly helmed Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and turned it ghetto by some reviews, attributes this fade to black to the authenticity he and fellow hosts bring to a genre that allows them to be their true colored selves. I would argue, however, that what this new breed of black game show hosts actually has going for it is the fact that they're almost all stand-up comics. Humor is their stock in trade, the shtick they bring to the MC role. This is the case with certain white hosts as well, Drew Carey, for example, of The Price is Right. But the difference between the black comedian turned host and the white funny man as MC is difference itself. While daytime TV may seem to be saying vive la différence, I would counter cynically that it is the same difference, that black isn't the new thing it seems. Funny has long been America's favorite way to see black people, the quintessential performative mode for people of color whose job it so often is and long has been to provide local color and comic relief. Funny is a kind of typecasting that is good enough for the lower brow brand of television most game shows represent. Accordingly, a black comedian fits the bill for most such shows. Cedric the Entertainer's homeboy humor didn't work for the upscale quiz show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and likewise wouldn't do for Wheel of Fortune, which has a loyal, literate following and doesn't need lowbrow black humor to boost its ratings. Jeopardy, the self-proclaimed thinking person's answer and question quiz, clearly is no country for droll black men. But if Jeopardy and Wheel are beyond the pale of black comedians who would be hosts, there are some shows whose success seems to depend on how low they can go. The newly popular Steve Harvey version of Family Feud is front-loaded with provocative questions designed to elicit racy retorts, responses over and above the nasty scale, as Harvey himself has said, which he then milks for laughs, mugging for the camera, high-fiving, and strutting across the stage. The show is so proud of playing dirty that its website redirects visitors to a YouTube cache of its most suggestive questions and sexually explicit answers. Now, the handout gives you a sampling, and I had a kind of moral ethical dilemma about whether to even give this nonsense an airing, so I finally decided to give you the questions without the answers. But the answer is pretty much always the same. It's just this endless penile joke. But there's one, I won't tell you which one, but you'll be able to figure it out. There's one for which the given answer was my wife. Now, much the same is true of the Newlywed Game, hosted by the black comedian Sherri Shepherd, who brags that her show is more racy than the original and boasts of having added to it not only comedy, but also sass, by which she seems to mean a heightened level of sex play, couched in innuendo. As examples of the kind of things she brings to the series, she offers her willingness to go boldly where no host has gone before by sharing details of her own love life. She too has had sex in public, for example, and by lifting the veil of ambiguity for clueless contestants who missed the point, such as the husband who apparently didn't understand that package is a euphemism for penis and needed her to spell out the fact that she was asking him the size of his. Shepard is clearly willing to go to great lengths for her job. What in the culture accounts for this turn in which the Negro is in such vulgar vogue? Should we forget Freud and take all the punchlines aimed below the belt as innocuous, lighthearted, all in good family fun? My own dirty mind defaults to black skin, white mass, and Frantz Fanon's claims about civilized white society's irrational longing for unusual eras of sexual license, and its propensity for projecting its own carnal desires onto black people, fixed at the genitals, he says. If there is anything to Fanon's argument that the Negro male is viewed as a penis symbol, a walking phallus, as it were, is there then some more sinister, salacious connection to be drawn between the body thrust of the game show Q&A and the black bodies of the game show hosts and many of the contestants? Is it a case of national Kardashianism? An inexplicable desire not only for sexual license, but for the black body. So which came first? Did black people blacken, as in dumb down and dirty up TV? Or did the turn into an unusual era of sexual license open a space for an always already sexualized black body? Is television merely trending dark and dirty out of and in response to that license, playing to modern America's appetite for the sexually explicit in everything from commercials to quiz shows to soap operas and reality series where naked is the newest normal? Naked Vegas, Naked and Afraid, Naked Castaway, Dating Naked, Buying Naked, on the Learning Channel, no less. Skin Wars, or what might be called Painted Naked. And primetime dramas like Empire, Power, Scandal, and How to Get Away with Murder, where sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or hip hop, are the hot commodities that sell the shows. Is our present preoccupation with the naked and the dark, the sexual revolution turned revolting, a kind of neo-blaxploitation? Or is it a new frankness about human sexuality and social reality that is to be celebrated, the long overdue death of Puritanism that has nothing to do with race? Back in the day, my mother often quipped that quiz shows were her classroom and crossword puzzles her lessons. Despite its fondness for risque business, the Game Show Network playfully claims in promos that the initials, GSN, actually stand for Get Smarter Now. I'm not sure exactly what my smart mother would make of today's TV programming, but I can say with some certainty that Wheel of Fortune would not be the only program turned down in the name of uplift. My mother, who had been a maid in real life and was tired of watching them on television, would be thrilled to see a black woman like Kerry Washington starring as a well-spoken, high-powered professional in a top-rated network drama created and produced by a black woman. But she also would be scandalized by scandal. If, out of curiosity, she made it to the second season of the series, she most likely wouldn't make it past the steamy flashback inauguration night episode where the newly sworn president slips away from his wife and children and the inaugural balls into the Oval Office for a session of horizontal balling with his black mistress atop the Lincoln desk. My mother might put it more delicately, but pantyless, prone, and silent, save for the coital moans of the late-night booty call, isn't the position she would imply for a 21st century black female protagonist. But it's not quite fair of me to upload onto my mother my own angst about this show and the culture of sex and violence that permeates contemporary TV. I understand the arguments about the campy tropes and over-the-top twists of soap opera. I take, too, the point many Scandal fans make that there's something subversive about a black woman's being passionately pursued by powerful men and getting to twist that desire to her own advantage and pleasure, getting to be a sensual, multifaceted, fabulously flawed female, loved and in love, rather than a sexless stick figure stereotype. I understand also that well into the second decade of the 21st century, positively representing the race and defending black womanhood are old baggage no actor should have to carry on screen. Still, for me, Scandal jumped the shark almost before it began, in part because it hooks itself on a great extramarital love affair, yet the how, why, when of a man and woman falling illicitly in love happened before we meet the characters, outside the frame of the televised narrative, and therefore don't exist. Even with flashbacks, what we actually see acted out amid incredible corruption and violence is less love than lust. Lots of steamy sex scenes, which taken together play a lot like soft porn. Missing in action is the throbbing, thwarted sexual tension, wrought of impossible, improbable, frenetic, yet unfulfilled desire, which for me makes for better TV. But then I'm old, I got this hair the old-fashioned way. To me, sexual tension plays better than sex. What if Olivia Pope, hotly pursued, desperately desired, just said a Nancy Reagan no to the White House man? That, however, is not the way primetime wears basic black. Hypersexual and superbad are America's other favorite ways to imagine colored people. It's no accident that the best roles for black actors are some of the worst characters ever to grace the TV screen. Good black guys would finish last in the ratings. Who, except my mother, would want to watch a black female Secretary of State as squeaky clean as Taya Leone's character on ABC's political thriller, Madam Secretary, who doesn't even get to have hot simulated TV sex with her own TV husband. When we do see them in bed together, they're talking. Wait 1 second. I thought I was a modern woman and a sophisticated critic, but some old-fashioned part of me wants the dream. Some old-fashioned part of me wants to see some semblance of the ethical lives, the uplifting racial profiling that was the American dream of black parents at the dawn of television. I want the happily married black female Secretary of State who gets to take care of husband, home, kids, and country, and keep her clothes on. I want the smart, sexy, ruthless black female criminal defense attorney who isn't a criminal, like Viola Davis's character on How to Get Away with Murder. Et tu, Mater. Most of you are too young to have been stabbed in the back by the most unkindest cut of all, the realization that you have become your mother. For good or ill, I am my mother's daughter, watching television much as she did, through the lens of race. I delight in the success of Kerry Washington and Viola Davis. I applaud Shonda Rhimes as the first black woman mastermind behind multiple award-winning TV series. I even begrudgingly salute Steve Harvey's success. I want to embrace the programs my people have made hits, but my jouissance is, I fear, always and forever disrupted by its refraction through the prism of race. If these shows were not technicolored, any displeasure wouldn't be guilty. Black makes all the difference. It carries me home to my mother's knee or some other joint. And the sad, shameful, unspeakable question that haunts my own 21st century TV viewing: was television in general, like my mother's forsaken game show favorite, Wheel of Fortune, easier to watch when it was all white, when there was nothing at stake other than cheap amusement and petty pleasure? Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. I just want to thank Tricia and Lynn, Brandy, and everyone here at the center for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here, even though I'm operating on about 4 hours of sleep. I had a little issue in Charlotte last night. The plane was decommissioned. They had to pull out another plane, so I got in really, really late last night. So I'm going to try to operate here on a little adrenaline here. Hopefully I can keep things going this morning. So, actually, let me,
Under view.
there we go. Okay. So, what I want to do today is follow two incredibly provocative presentations and hopefully give you a little background as to how it is that the structure of the industry contributes to some of the observations we've been hearing about and some of the things we're going to hear about later on today. So this is a project that is in year 2. It's a 5-year project that's attempting to put together the most comprehensive look we have to date into the ways in which race and gender factor into the structure of the industry. It is unabashedly advocacy research in the sense that it's designed to hopefully have an impact on the industry. Just as an aside, I have a book project that's been percolating for a number of years. In fact, the data from this study, once it's complete, 3 years from now, will kind of form the backdrop for a book project that really tries to look at the relationship between the industry structure as it relates to race and gender and the types of representations that circulate. So for this particular report and the research I'm going to be talking about today, there are multiple audiences. You know, one of the core audiences happens to be the industry itself, all right? The report is delivered electronically. It's been covered in hundreds of media outlets, and we've really focused on the trade press that covers the industry, that those in the industry use to sort of make sense of what's happening. It's really a case study of industry practices, and the goal, as I said before, is to change those practices. So let me just talk for a second about the funding strategy behind the report. So normally when we do this type of research at the Bunche Center, we're reaching out to foundations for funding. In this case, we decided to go directly to the industry. All right, again, we decided to go directly to the industry. You might say, well, gee, conflict of interest, how is that gonna sort of affect the objectivity of the work? Well, in this case, we argued that by reaching out to the industry itself and having skin in the game, so to speak, having a stake in the research, they're probably gonna read the reports. It also gives us entree into those executive suites that are making a lot of the decisions that shape what we see in television. So just so you know, full disclosure, the folks behind this particular report in terms of the funding, Sony Pictures Entertainment, ABC Disney, Time Warner, HBO, CBS, William Morris Endeavor, which is one of the largest agencies, talent agencies, Oprah Winfrey Network, BET, Overbrook Productions, which is Will Smith and Jada Pinkett's production company, just to kind of give you a sense. So I love this quote here, which kind of really puts into perspective what's at stake, all right? Just the overwhelming impact that stories have on the way we think about ourselves. They're even part of our dreams in terms of, thinking about how we fit into the world. So it's not just entertainment. One dimension, of course, deals with access. We're talking about employment. We're talking about an incredibly lucrative industry. People make lots of money in the Hollywood industry. And so we're talking about access to certain types of jobs when we talk about Hollywood diversity. We also know, as Anne and others have pointed out, that people of color consume a disproportionate amount of media. In terms of Hollywood films, 51% of the frequent moviegoers are people of color, and we know that frequent moviegoers account for more than half of all tickets sold, all right? That's pretty amazing if you think about it. Now, think about that in the context of what we see at the movies, and you see a really interesting disconnect there. Also, on television, black households watch, in some cases, almost 50% more TV than white households. Latinos also watch more television than their white counterparts. So we're talking about a very interesting issue here. We're talking about access, or the lack thereof, to the people making decisions and actually producing the representations we see, and yet we see that they're being consumed disproportionately by people of color. So what about those representations? Well, they're the stories that we tell about ourselves, or rather that other people tell about us. We often deal with those images, with those representations, in terms of thinking about who we are, who we aren't, who we hope to be. There's a huge amount of research that talks about media effects and the role that images have in society. And one of the things we know they do is they tend to normalize certain ways of being, particularly popular images that are repeated over and over again. So there's definitely a political dimension. And this is one of the reasons why, as Matt and Anne have pointed out, that the struggle over media has been so significant throughout our history. It's no accident that the NAACP, when the movement toward integration was underway, one of the first things they targeted is the media industry, the image industry. The Birth of a Nation campaign, for example, in the early 20th century, Amos and Andy, the very beginning of television. These were important moments because the idea was if the images of African Americans that are being circulated aren't uplifting, then it's very unlikely that the larger society is going to welcome blacks in. At least that was the thinking in this area. So representation, of course, becomes a very important consideration. And here, of course, I'm borrowing a famous diagram from Stuart Hall and Duguay's book on representation, that talks about the relationship that representation has to a number of important moments. Kind of the construction and negotiation of identity, of production, what's produced, what's consumed, and ultimately the regulation of boundaries and the way we think about ourselves as a part of the group and who's in, who's out, and what the meanings of those labels actually are. So in a way, I'm thinking about this conception of representation as a theoretical frame that causes me to consider the different ways in which representation exerts its force in society, particularly in terms of its normalizing function. So the question for me today is, how does industry structure influence this particular process? And today I'm going to focus primarily on this structure and think about it in terms of access for racialized people and for women and men differently. Okay, so here's a chart that we're all probably familiar with. It sort of gives us a sense of where we're headed demographically. We see that there's a point where the two lines cross, and after that point, of course, we become a majority-minority nation. Already, most of the babies born in America are non-white, and so the young population has already kind of reached the point where minorities are in the majority. But the overall population, sometime around 2043 or so, is expected to be majority-minority. So what does this portend for the Hollywood industry? What does this portend for the structure that I'm going to be describing to you today? Well, the data for this study come from 172 films that were released in 2012 and 175 that were released in 2013. Just to note, the study is called the 2015 Hollywood Diversity Report, but we're always about a year to a year and a half behind because we have to wait for a season to end before we can collect complete data and then subject that data to analysis, which usually takes us about a year. So it's an ongoing process. In fact, we're in the field right now collecting data for a report that's going to be released in February 2016. We also look at 1,105 TV shows from the 2012-13 season. Believe it or not, there are that many TV shows. If we look across the various platforms, broadcast, cable, and digital platforms, we look at everything that's in the pipeline for a given season. In fact, our data set is this huge matrix that has about 85,000 cells in it. 1,105 rows by about 80, 85 columns of data, including everything from talent, diversity behind the camera, ratings data, and so forth and so on. So it's a pretty large data set. So we're particularly interested in lead talent, race and gender, director, race and gender, show creator, race and gender, writer diversity, for film, box office figures, and household ratings in television. So let's talk about film. I know this is a conference primarily about television, but there's an interesting relationship between film and television. The key metric here is going to be the degree of underrepresentation. And here I want you to flash back to the population chart I showed you. So what we're going to be interested in is sort of what share of a particular category in the industry and industry employment do women and people of color represent relative to their share of the overall population. That gives us the degree of underrepresentation. So the first thing we look at is film leads in 2013. And we see that in that year, women are underrepresented by a factor of about 2 to 1 among leads. That is to say, only 25.3% of the leads were women, when women make up slightly more than half of the population. For minorities, the degree of representation is greater than 2 to 1. Only 16.7% of the leads were minorities in 2013, when minorities make up, at that point, about 38% of the population and sort of approaching 40% right now. So what about film directors? Well, here women, a whopping 8 to 1, underrepresented by a factor of nearly 8 to 1 among film directors. Only 6.3% of the film directors were women. And this is one of the reasons why there was such an outcry when Ava DuVernay, for example, for her film Selma, wasn't even nominated. It's very rare that you have a woman director, and a woman of color is even rarer in Hollywood. If we look at minorities, we see they were underrepresented by a factor of about 2 to 1. That is to say, 17.8% of film directors in 2013 were people of color. I should also add that this was an outlier year of sorts. This was the year that many people refer to as the year of black film. We had 12 Years a Slave, and so forth, and all these films that were critically acclaimed with black leads and black directors. A year that probably won't be duplicated again anytime soon, but that's something we're going to be watching with our data over time. Well, film writers. Here we see that women were underrepresented by a factor of nearly 4 to 1. 12.9% of film writers in 2013 were women. Minorities were underrepresented by a factor of greater than 3 to 1. Only 11.8% of the film writers were people of color. Now, a pretty revealing chart kind of tells us what the executive suites look like. The places where decisions are made about what's to be produced, with what budget, with what cast, etc. If we look at the chair CEO of the top studios, and we're looking at 18 studios here, we see that the CEO chair, 94% white, 100% male, right? If we move down a level in terms of management, looking at senior management, the senior management group, we see it's 92% white and 83% male. It's only when we get to the unit heads, the head of casting, finance, production, etc., where we see a little bit more diversity in terms of gender, but none in terms of race. 96% white, 61% male. So that kind of gives you a sense of what the overarching structure is that has a pretty important impact on kind of the decisions are made and kind of who gets what types of positions at the lower level. Anne referenced Shonda Rhimes, for example. Well, Shonda's success in some way is, I guess, the result of someone at ABC taking a risk and giving her that position in the first place. She hits this formula with Grey's Anatomy that's been, duplicated in many ways with her other shows, Private Practice, Scandal, How to Get Away with Murder, and she's become something of a phenomenon, which is, exceptional and certainly not something we've seen a person of color do in the past. Never mind the fact that a person of color also happens to be a woman. It's very, very unusual. So let's talk about television in terms of these structural issues. Well, if we look at TV leads in 2012-13, we look at broadcast scripted shows. We have 107 shows here that were in the sample. Nearly proportionate representation for women. 48.6% of the leads were women, compared to 1.4% that were men. Cable scripted, a little bit less proportionate. 37.1% of the leads were women. If we look at TV leads in terms of race, ethnicity, we see that people of color are underrepresented by a factor of greater than 5 to 1 among leads in broadcast television. Only 6.5% of the leads were people of color during that season. In cable, we see that they're underrepresented by a factor of nearly 2 to 1. So the situation is a little bit better. 19.3% of the leads in cable in 2012-13 were people of color. And the difference, of course, has to do with cable networks. The fact that they tend to be more niche targeted, the BETs, the TV1s, where their leads are almost 100%, African American, L-Ray television, Latinos, and so forth and so on. So there tends to be a little bit more niche targeting in cable, which creates opportunities for people of color to get in. Of course, those networks overall tend to have lower ratings than the broadcast networks that are, even though they've been losing market share, are still the big tents in terms of television. So what about TV show creators? And this is a very important status within the industry because, of course, the creator sets the stage for a number of decisions that are going to be made. They come up with the basic premise of the setting, which has severe implications for the casting, for the writer's room, and a number of other things that they go on in terms of storytelling. In broadcast television that season, minorities were underrepresented. Women were underrepresented by a factor of nearly 2 to 1 in broadcast scripted shows. 28.9% of the creators were women. In cable, they were underrepresented by a factor of greater than 2 to 1. Only about 22.6% of the creators were women in 2012-13. And here, in an interesting reversal of sorts, you remember that for minorities, the figures were a little bit better in cable, and for women, they're a little bit worse in cable because a lot of the cable networks tend to skew more towards men. I mean, there are some like Lifetime and ABC Family that are primarily driven by women viewers, but there are a lot of others in cable that are primarily driven by men, and therefore we don't see the same type of positive effect that we saw for minorities in cable that we see for women. So what about TV creators in terms of race? Well, broadcast scripted programming, greater than 6 to 1 underrepresentation for minority show creators. Only 5.9% of the show creators in broadcast scripted were minorities. Again, cable scripted, greater than 3 to 1, factor of 3 to 1 in terms of underrepresentation. 10.7% of these creators were minorities. Again, the situation is a little bit better in cable for the same reasons I mentioned earlier. That a lot of the shows in cable, particularly on networks targeted toward people of color, were also created by people of color. So what about TV writers? Looking at the share of broadcast episodes that were written by women, we see that 32% of those episodes were written by women in the 2012-13 season, which is better than film. I mean, women are doing a little bit better in television than they are in film, but it's still less than proportionate representation. The same is true in terms of cable episodes. Only 29.5% were written by women. Again, less than proportionate representation, but still better than film. And in fact, that's a common refrain. TV tends to be a little bit better than film in terms of diversity for men and women, although that's not saying a lot because the numbers are still pretty bad. If we look at TV writers in terms of minority status, we see that in broadcast television, minority writers were underrepresented by a factor of greater than 3 to 1 among, for their share of broadcast episodes. 9.7% of those episodes were directed by people of color, despite the fact that people of color make up, close to 40% of the population. In cable, it's a similar factor, greater than 3 to 1. 11.8% of the episodes were written by people of color. Writing is a very interesting aspect of the business. I actually have been working for the last 10 years or so with the Writers Guild, and the disconnect between sort of what the population looks like and what writers' rooms look like is quite amazing when you figure that that's the place where story ideas are being generated, where the types of tropes that Anne and others have pointed out are sort of trotted out again repeatedly. This is where it happens. This is the creative space where these things happen. And I want to talk more about that possibly in the Q&A, and sort of the dynamics of the writer's room and how that plays into the process. TV directors. TV is a writer's medium, but directors do work in TV. They tend to be more freelance than on staff. But if we look at the share of broadcast episodes directed by women, we see the degree of underrepresentation was greater than 4 to 1. Remember, in film, it was almost 8 to 1. So again, women are doing better in television, but again, nothing to really write home about. The share of cable episodes directed by women, 11.2%, also represents a degree of underrepresentation by a factor of greater than 4 to 1. I think I survived the spill here. Okay, and the computer survived it. That's the important thing. Okay, TV directors. Share of broadcast episodes directed by minorities in 2012-13, nearly 5 to 1 underrepresentation for minorities. Only 7.5% of the episodes directed by minorities. Thank you. And in cable, nearly 3 to 1. 12.7% of the episodes directed by minorities. So if we, there we go. Thank you. So if we look at the comparable chart for television that we looked at for film, looking at the executive suites, we see a similar story. Here we see that among the CEOs, and here we're talking about 48 different networks we looked at, 96% white, 71% male. It's a little bit more gender diversity in television than in film, but in terms of race, just as bad. If we move down a level to senior management, we see 93% white, 73% male. And by the time we get down to unit heads, we do see a little bit more racial diversity, 86% white, 55% male. Not a pretty picture, but again, a little bit better than what we saw in film. So what's the bottom line? Well, the Hollywood industry, after all, is an industry. And anyone you talk to in the industry who works in the industry will say it's about the bottom line, it's about making money. All right? Now we know that there are other things going on in terms of the images that circulate and the impact those images have. And we know that the people who work in the industry are real people. So they're bringing to their jobs their own baggage and their own predispositions and their own ways of thinking about what's viable and what's not. But the conventional wisdom says that it's about the bottom line and it's about what sells. It's about selling advertisements, and that the decisions made are rational in the sense that they are designed to maximize those things. So what about the relationship between diversity, which as we have seen so far is rather lacking, compared to the nation's population, and the actual bottom line? Well, here we have a chart that looks at minority cast share by box office for theatrical films in 2012-2013. And what we see is that films that have casts that are from 21 to 30% minority, lo and behold, on average, have the highest box office. And we're talking about films that as a group, on average, earned over $143 million. And so some of the films that fall into this category are films like The Hunger Games, Catching Fire. You may just flash back to some of those films if you happen to see them, and some of the people in them, you get a sense of what I'm talking about. Iron Man 3, Star Trek Into Darkness, and G.I. Joe Retaliation. All right, just a couple of examples of films that fell into that category. What's interesting to note is that most of the films made, though, fall to the left of that peak, you know, to the place where we have less than 11% minority cast share or 11 to 20% minority cast share. So Hollywood is continuing to make lots of films that aren't very diverse, despite the fact that we know that more diverse films tend to generate higher box office. And again, think back to the figures I gave you earlier about who buys tickets, you know, who's responsible for most of the tickets these days. So what about television? This particular chart shows us minority cast share by ratings, broadcast scripted 2012-2013. And here we see that television ratings actually peak for shows that are from 31 to 40% minority in terms of overall cast. And it's not accidental that that diversity interval happens to be where the actual minority share of the population falls right now. And so here we're talking about shows like Under the Dome on CBS in that season, New Girl on Fox, and Scandal, a show that Ann talked about quite a bit. It's quite popular, all right? Now, it's also important to note here that ratings also peak for shows whose writers' rooms are from 31 to 40% minority. However, I know from Writers Guild data that 63% of shows had writers' rooms that were less than 10% minority. In fact, many of those shows had not a single minority in the writers' room, all right? So what about cable? Again, cable ratings peak at the interval where casts are about 31 to 40% minority. And so here you have shows like Suits from USA, Army Wives from Lifetime, and White Collar on USA. So what I want to do is make sense of this disconnect. How is it, on the one hand, that we know we have an incredibly diversifying nation and set of audiences, but yet the numbers that we see in Hollywood seem to be woefully out of step with that. That is to say, the executive suites are dominated by white men. Most of the decision-making positions are dominated by white men. The writers' rooms aren't very diverse in terms of people writing and telling stories, and the people directing aren't very diverse in terms of race or gender. And you know, in some instances, what we see in front of the camera may be a little bit better in terms of diversity, but is it really better in terms of what's being represented? Well, how do we make sense of that disconnect? Well, the work I've done with people in the industry, and I do a lot of consulting in the industry, which is giving me kind of a first-hand look at the production process. The typical situation is whenever you see a program that may actually, you know, have diverse faces in front of the camera, if you look behind the camera, we're talking about a uniformly monochromatic type of space where it's typically white men with a few white women controlling the production, making a lot of decisions, writing the scripts, revising the scripts, etc. So it's a very insular industry. It's a high risk and comfort industry. It's an industry that is characterized by most new shows and movies failing. That is to say, the movies don't live up to expectation. There are a few major box office films that drive profitability for the studios, and other films don't do as well. TV shows, most new shows fail. And that's changing a little bit now because of shifting changes in the technology with different platforms and modes of distribution. But it's still true. Most shows, we're beyond the era of the mega hits where everyone watched the same thing. In fact, some people said the Cosby Show was the last show that everyone watched. So it's an industry that's very high risk. Shows fail, and the people who are making decisions primarily seek comfort. They look to surround themselves with people they can work with, they feel they can trust. And when we're starting with an industry that is dominated by white men, often that means they're surrounding themselves with other white men. So that's sort of the thinking process that leads to the types of executive suites and writing rooms we see. At the same time, we have agency gatekeepers, the talent agencies. Increasingly today, projects, movies and TV shows are packaged. That is to say, it's not like a network just decides we're going to make this show and we're going to solicit pitches. Often these ideas originate in the talent agencies, and they take their rosters that are already dominated by whites, and white men in particular, and use them as leverage to sell to the networks ideas that they develop in advance. They're almost like a minor league for some of the networks and studios. And so they have package drivers, the people, the names, the A-listers who make these package projects sort of interesting to the networks and studios. And if we look at those package drivers, we see that for the current season, even though most of this work is looking back a season or two, for the current season, when we examined it, we saw that minorities were underrepresented by a factor of 4 to 1 among these package drivers. And that this degree of underrepresentation was the same degree that we saw during the 2001-2 season. So despite all this talk about diversity and change, if you really look at the structure of the process and how it's working, very little has changed. Then you add the academies, the Film Academy, the Movie Academy, the Oscars, the Television Academy, the Emmys. And what we argue in the report is that something like self-fulfilling prophecy is at work here. The Academy set certain standards as to what counts as quality, who merits recognition. Well, when you start with Academy membership that is 90-something% white and 80-something% male, you have these people setting the standards as to what should be acknowledged, what should be lauded. And as we see every year when the Oscar nominations come out, with a few exceptions, people of color and women are notoriously absent from the most prestigious categories. And what this does, of course, is reaffirm within the industry what counts as quality and sort of highbrow and the types of projects that even if we don't expect to get the ratings we wanted, this is quality TV, so we have to make it. People of color and often women are notoriously absent from those types of considerations. And so what we get in the end is business as usual. We have a certain common sense that sort of guides people in the industry as to what types of projects are viable. You have a type of groupthink that's in place in terms of the types of risks that are worth taking, which are few and far between. Every once in a while we have an accidental success like a Shonda Rhimes who creates an empire, no pun intended, because of her success. So we argue that we actually have a conflict of interest at play. On the one hand, the major network studios, multinational conglomerates that own them, would be better served by producing a program that appeals to the broader, diversifying audience. And yet, that's not what's being made, not consistently. And the reason that that's not happening is because the people who occupy positions of power in these executive suites are making what they know how to make, which is not the type of diverse programming that the audience, has demonstrated that it wants. Moreover, they're reluctant to surround themselves with people who can give that perspective, who can help them think outside their own narrow range of experience to bring in other types of ideas, because that, of course, would essentially be tantamount to admitting that, maybe I don't know what's best, or I don't have the whole picture. And so we have this revolving door of debate about diversity and what can be done, which tends to amount to a number of lottery systems, where we have these development programs, writing programs, where one person or two people get an opportunity, and yet there are thousands of talented people out there who never get a shot. And so in the end, the change has been glacial, and we see people who don't necessarily have the diversity of experience attempting to write narratives that they think reflect where the nation is going. And so I think that's why we have some of the interesting and troubling tropes about race and gender repeated over and over again in the industry, because there just isn't a space to bring in new voices. Thank you very much. I'll stop there and hopefully regain my my sense of being awake here. Thank you.